Hey, yo, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. This is Smart TCG, and today I'm going to be going over my top 10 decks currently in the Prismatic Evolutions format. Prismatic Evolutions has caused a lot of changes to the standard format, and today I'm going to be going over where I think the top decks land. We have many upcoming major tournaments like the European International Championships, most notably, which will be taking place next week. So it's important to keep on top of the metagame and see where these top decks are standing. So with that being said, if you enjoy the content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and let's hop right into it. Alrighty, hopping into number 10 here, we have a brand new addition to the top 10 list, and that is going to be Gouging Fire. Gouging Fire most recently got second place at the Merida Regional Championships piloted by Mauricio, and after playing some games with this deck, it actually has a lot of potential. Yes, it is a turbo deck with that Gouging Fire that is going to be looking to take big one-hit KOs. However, you do have some versatility with this deck with cards like Monkey Dory to heal damage off from that Magma Basin, and then also cards like Delphox, which can take multiple prize cards, as many decks currently aren't playing, cards like Manaphy, so that you can use that Delphox, for example, against something like Gardevoir to knock out multiple Curlias. So this kind of feels like a turbo deck, but it has more options. This is a reason as to why I think this deck is actually stronger than a deck like Raging Bolt, for example, or something like Turbo Roaring Moon, just because it can do so much more. So yeah, Gouging Fire definitely has a lot of potential right now. And yeah, I think there's definitely a reason as to why it most recently got second place at the Merida Regional Championships. I will say sometimes it can feel a little bit clunky, I know, in the finals. Mauricio did not necessarily draw very well, which can sometimes be a problem with this deck. But when you do get it going, it definitely has a chance against a lot of things. And I think it's pretty underrated right now. All right, let's hop into number 9. Alrighty, hopping into number 9 here, we have Charizard. Charizard has been a deck that's been getting some talk recently as the metagame has shifted a little bit more towards the turbo decks, and I think it has quite a bit of potential right now. Now, the biggest problem with this deck is Budu. If you play against a deck like a Dragapult, for example, and they have access to Budu, pretty much any deck that has access to the Budu, they can cause lots of problems. However, honestly, a lot of decks right now actually aren't playing the Budu, which means that you can set up normally if they don't have that item lock card. So overall, I think with the metagame kind of starting to go more towards these turbo decks, for example, things like Gouging Fire and also Miraidon as well, that does serve very well for Charizard. However, decks like Dragapult are still seeing so much play, and that matchup is quite difficult for Charizard. Things like the Gardevoir matchup as well is pretty scary, as they have access to things like Mawile and now also Mimikyu as well, which can be quite annoying to deal with. So I would say the deck has, potential, but in my opinion, it's not necessarily in the best spot, but it could be a surprise pick heading into upcoming tournaments if it hits the right matchups. Alrighty, hopping into number 8 here, we have Snorlax Stall. Now, Snorlax Stall has been doing great in online tournaments recently, seeing a lot of success, and I think it's, largely due to the fact that a lot of people are cutting switch cards from their deck. For example, decks like Miraidon typically are only playing one switch card, which means that they really don't have any answer to multiple Snorlaxes. Decks like Dragapult and Gardevoir as well kind of depends on how many Turo and switch card they play, but, those matchups typically are relatively close, and if decks like Miraidon are pushing difficult matchups like Lugia more out of the format, then Snorlax puts itself actually in a pretty good position right now. This is a deck that you can definitely take advantage of players who don't necessarily know exactly what to do against it. So I think that's a big reason as to why this deck sees success. Is not a whole lot of people want to practice against the Snorlax deck, so you can definitely take advantage of players with that. But overall, I think this deck is very powerful. I currently am liking the Rotom variant a little bit more than the Pokestop one. The Pokestop one is pretty prone to Budu, but if you have access to Rotom, you are going to be able to find those supporters a little bit more consistently to be able to get that Snorlax lock off through something like item lock. Overall, I think Snorlax is a pretty powerful deck right now. It still takes a sketchy matchup into, decks like Lugia, for example, even though you have things like Temple of Sinnoh and the Giacomo. So if you don't really care about that matchup, you can just cut those cards for potentially just, more consistency. But I currently have it in right now just to kind of give yourself a chance. But all right, let's hop into number 7. Alrighty, hopping into number 7 here, we have Archaladon. Archaladon is, in my opinion, a pretty well-positioned deck at the moment. I used to play Pokestop in this deck, but I have gone back to Jamming Tower just because tool cards are very prevalent right now, especially in decks like Dragapult, Gardevoir, and pretty much any evolution deck. Even decks like Miraidon as well are playing that Bravery Charm. So just having access to that Jamming Tower to be able to shut off those tools has felt very good. I think this deck is in, a pretty decent position, especially after Miraidon's most recent regional win at the Merida Regional Championships. Most notably, that deck did not play Zapdos, which means they have no way to one-shot a Duraludon with an Iron Hands using that Ampu very much. If they have the Zapdos, they can hit for 130 on that first turn, knocking out a Duraludon and kind of take control of the game. However, if they don't have that, which a lot of lists are starting to cut, that matchup becomes significantly more difficult for Miraidon to beat. So at the moment, I think with people kind of not really worrying about this deck, I think it's quietly in a pretty strong position. Also with decks like, Cloth, starting to see more success. You do pretty well against that deck as you just have so much healing. So yeah, the deck is, pretty good. The one thing it sometimes runs into is a little bit of inconsistency problems, but if you are able to set up and get that so powerful Origin Form Dialga V-Star off, you can just take over games, and your deck has a lot of potential. All right, let's hop into number 6. Alrighty, hopping into number 6 here, we have Lost Zone Toolbox. Lost Zone Toolbox has made its way back into the top 10, and there's a couple of reasons as to why. I would say the biggest reason right now is the format is starting to slow down. We see so many setup-based decks, currently that are seeing success. Decks like Gardevoir, decks, like Dragapult as well, which are actually two matchups that Lost Zone does pretty well against. There are a lot of Gardevoir lists right now that are cutting things like Manaphy and also Fluttermane, which means you have a really strong matchup into that. Your Dragapult matchup as well is relatively decent as you can kind of just run them over. You do have to be a little bit careful of that Budu, towards the beginning of the game. But if you are able to deal with it relatively easily, then you should be able to take over games. Yeah, I think this deck is, pretty good. I will say the other reason as well why this deck is starting to see more success is decks like Regidrago just are not seeing a whole lot of success and, a whole lot of play. In the previous format, Regidrago was typically the most or second most played deck at the majority of major tournaments. But now that, the format has kind of changed, just like the meta decks are a lot more, hostile towards that deck, Lost Zone Toolbox can actually more safely come back and see success. Now, overall, I think that, Lost Zone, definitely moving forward is going to see success as long as, decks like, Gardevoir, for example, aren't playing things like Fluttermane and also, cards like Manaphy, and if Regidrago doesn't come, back. However, if those, things, do happen and, Gardevoir starts to really struggle versus Lost Zone because this deck is gaining more popularity, then those tech cards will definitely go back into these decks, and maybe we'll see Regidrago come back. But I don't think Lost Box is necessarily a big enough deck for people to kind of prepare and tech for it. That there definitely will be some people that do that, but I think the majority of people don't necessarily have this deck on their radar as a true threat. But I personally think it's pretty good. So all right, let's hop to number 5. Alrighty, hopping into number 5 here, we got Cloth. Cloth has made its return. This is going to be the list that Rolando used to get top 4 at the most recent Merida Regional Championships. And with the addition of Budu, this deck gets a lot better, being able to item lock at the beginning of the game and also pair that up with Poison to be able to take knockouts on one prize Pokemon at the very beginning of the game, or getting lots of chip damage in against a high HP Pokemon to set up Cloth, in my opinion, is really what this deck needed. It buys you a little bit of time to kind of develop your board state. Also, the addition of the black belts as well, making it a little bit easier to get those one shots against those high HP Pokemon, just really makes this deck a lot more powerful. I think this deck is pretty good. I will say that your Gardevoir matchup, if they are able to get fully set up, can be pretty difficult, but the rest of your matchups overall feel relatively okay. Things like your Dragapult matchup feels, close. Your Lugia matchup is close. You do really well against a lot of those turbo decks as well. So you're pretty decent into a lot of things, and this is, definitely one of the best decks that is able to really abuse that Budu's item lock. So yeah, I think this deck is, pretty good. It's a ton of fun as well. It can feel a little bit chaotic at times. That's one of the problems with this deck, is that sometimes you just necessarily aren't able, to get going just because there's so much that is kind of happening with the deck. So, that's, kind of one of the problems. But when it does get going, it has a ton of potential and it's a ton of fun. And I think it's going to see success moving forward, especially heading into the European International Championships that are coming up. Alrighty, hopping into number 4 here, we have Lugia V-Star. Lugia V-Star, still one of the better decks in the format, especially with the addition of that Regigigas, which really helps out against matchups like Charizard and Dragapult. This deck, when it gets going, it can pretty much beat anything in the format, especially with Dragapult expected to be the most or second most played deck in the standard format. That is one of the matchups that this deck really thrives against if it is able to get going. So I think Lugia is putting itself in a pretty decent spot. Your turbo matchups as well aren't necessarily that bad, especially with cards like the Legacy Energy can kind of fix those prize trades. So if more turbo decks like Gouging Fire, for example, start to see more success, then I think that Lugia could definitely put itself into the spotlight. And also if decks like Dragapult continue to see so much play, that is one of Lugia's better matchups. And yeah, I think this deck is putting itself in a pretty decent spot to see success moving forward. Overall, I've been liking this list. If you do want to add a tech card for the Gardevoir matchup, you can cut a boss's orders for something like a Drapion, or you could potentially cut the Weird Ear V for that card, as that does help out in the Gardevoir matchup. But I still think that matchup is relatively close, kind of regardless if you play it or not. So yeah, when Lugia gets going, it's absolutely crazy. But when it doesn't get going, which oftentimes happens, sometimes you just draw into these hands of, 3 to 4, sometimes even 5 energies. The deck can feel relatively weak. So it is honestly the glass cannon of the format, but has a lot of potential and I think is going to see success moving forward. All right, let's hop into number 3. Alrighty, hopping into number 3 here, we have Miraidon. Now, this is going to be the list that Azul GG used to win the most recent Merida Regional Championships. This deck has it all. It, in my opinion, is the most versatile turbo deck in the format, as you have so many different powerful lightning type of attackers. You are fast and consistent as well. You have really options against any top deck in the format. If you're playing against one of those setup decks like Gardevoir or Dragapult, you have access to that Iron Hands' amp you very much. If you're playing against, something like a Lugia, you can attack early game with that Iron Hands, or potentially something like that Raikou V. If you're playing against a deck that has a 2-prize Pokemon with 200 HP or more, you can use things like Raichu or that, Miraidon early game to be able to take knockouts. You just have pretty much everything you need. You have like consistency. You're not also necessarily heavily affected by the Budu, because this is a deck that typically almost always wants to go second. So you'll always get a turn of items, be able to use things like that secret box, like those electric generators as well. So yeah, I think overall this deck is really, really good. It did not surprise me to see it see so much success. There was also one in top 4, and then there was another one in top 8 and also top 16. So the deck just kind of completely dominated, saw tons of success. Now, the big question is are people going to tech for it? If Dragapult wants to have a better matchup, they can play things like Lost Vacuum to remove that Bravery Charm, even something like the Clef Key as well. If, Gardevoir, wants to tech for it, they can play things like that Mimikyu potentially, or something like the Clef Key. You also take kind of sketchy matchups to some of the other turbo decks, things like Gouging Fire and specifically Raging Bolt aren't necessarily your strongest matchups, can provide some problems, but you are, very fast and you kind of have the ability to beat, anything just with how consistent you are. Kind of what you lose in matchup spread, you gain in consistency. So, a lot of these matchups, which might be hypothetically kind of difficult, so many of the times you can just, steal games because you're pretty much able to achieve your strategy pretty much the majority of games. So yeah, Miraidon, no surprise that it won the first major event with Prismatic Evolutions legal, and I definitely expected to see a lot of success moving forward. However, I do think there are 2 decks that are just slightly stronger than it right now. Let's hop into number 2. Alrighty, hopping into number 2 here, we have Gardevoir. Now, this is going to be the list that I used along with Michael Davidson to get top 32 and top 8 at the most recent Merida Regional Championships, and I have been loving this deck. The best thing about Gardevoir is its versatility. You can just do so many different things. You have so much outplay potential as well. It is one of the hardest decks in the format, so if you want to play it to a major tournament, make sure that you do have plenty of practice with it, as it's very easy to misplay with. But if you are able to pilot it correctly, you can truly unlock a lot of special things, and your deck can see a lot of success. The big thing, though, about this deck is it takes 50-50s against the majority of the format. You're about 50-50 into Dragapult, about 50-50, maybe slightly favored against decks like Lugia. You're close but favored into some of the turbo decks as well, like Gouging Fire and Raging Bolt. I think you are about slightly favored into those matchups. Your Miraidon matchup is pretty scary. However, if you are able to get a board state going, you can definitely make big comebacks in it. And yeah, you pretty much have a chance to win, but kind of have a chance to lose against everything. So that's one of the things you have to be, very, very, careful about. when choosing this deck. But when it gets going and you know how to pilot it, it just has so much potential. It can run into some consistency problems at times at the beginning of the games, which is why I have one deck that is just slightly better than it right now. Let's hop into number 1. Alrighty, hopping into number 1 here, we have Dragapult EX. Dragapult EX, in my opinion, is the best deck in the standard format. This is going to be the list that Aiden Kuz used most recently to get top 8 at the Merida Regional Championships. Brent Tonneson, as well, another very successful player, got top 16 with this list, and I think this is a fantastic starting point if you are interested in playing Dragapult. Dragapult has lots of outplay potential with that Phantom Dive. Getting access to that Budew as well can buy you crucial time to get your board state fully set up, and especially in such a heavy setup based format, cards like Dusclops and Dusknoir have so much potential to wipe the board. Just cards like Dragapult and also the Dusknoir engine are so powerful in a format where there are tons of setup decks. For example, you have the Dragapult Mirror Match, you have Gardevoir as well. Lost Zone Toolbox is starting to see more success. There's just a lot of decks that put down plenty of liabilities that these cards are able to, see success against. So yeah, I think this deck is absolutely fantastic. Your one pretty scary matchup is the Lugia one. If you are able to slow them down at the very beginning of the game with something like that Budew, and then you also have access to Temple of Sinnoh, you definitely can win. But that is one matchup that you definitely are looking to avoid as a Dragapult player. But pretty much overall, your matchups are very, very strong. You pretty much have a chance versus the majority of the decks in the format. You have a little bit more consistency in my opinion than the Gardevoir archetype, which is why I currently have Dragapult just right above it, just because you're more able to get board states established. And yeah, overall, I think Dragapult is not necessarily far and away the strongest deck in the format. I don't think right now there is a clear-cut S tier deck, but I do think it does, a few things better than some of the other top decks in the format. So that's why I currently have it at number 1. But that is going to do it today for my top 10. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Feel free to put them down there. Let me know if you agree or disagree, or if there's anything that I missed. Feel free to let your opinions be heard. So anyways, that's going to do it for today. Thanks for all the support as always. I appreciate it. If you enjoy the content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and I hope you found this video useful. Anyways, this is Smart TCG, and I'll speak with you guys again soon. Peace out.